Hello everyone, welcome to Q's Book Reviews. My name is Quinn. Today I'm going to be talking about the book Ulysses by James Joyce, which I just finished up at the end of February, and I'll just be giving my sort of broad thoughts on it. I was considering not even making a video on this book, just because I'm not sure how much insight I can give you on it, but I did a little look on YouTube and I actually didn't really find many reviews of it at all. So I figured even an idiot's perspective is probably better than no perspective, so I figured I'd just give some quick thoughts about it. It's not really going to be a review in a traditional sense. I'm not sure it's really possible to even review a book like this. So instead I'll just be pointing out some things in the text that I found particularly interesting and sort of just some of my key takeaways from it. If you're not familiar with this book, it was written by the modernist author James Joyce, who is from Ireland. And it was published in 1914. It essentially takes place just over one day, June 16th, 1904, I believe, and we're following primarily two different characters who I'll get into, but obviously a whole bunch of other characters throughout Dublin as well. I personally went into this book knowing very little. That's what I like to do with a lot of books. But given its already pretty challenging nature, I feel like it might actually help a bit to know some going into it. So I'll give a brief overview of the plot. As I said, this book takes place over just one day, following our two main characters, Stephen Daedalus and Leopold Bloom, as they make their way throughout Dublin, Ireland. Stephen is a young man, a wannabe sort of writer, poet, very much in his own head. He's sort of estranged himself from the rest of his family, and is living in a very tenuous position right now, teaching students. Leopold Bloom, on the other hand, is a middle-aged man. He works as an ad agent for a newspaper company, and he's very much cast as an outsider from the rest of society. He was born Jewish, although he's been baptized multiple times, and this leads to a lot of very interesting dynamics with the rest of the people of Dublin. He's married to his wife Molly Bloom, however, very much importantly for the story, she is about to start an affair with another man, Blazes Boylan, and so we really follow Bloom as he's essentially being cuckolded by his wife. This story is also a very loose retelling of Homer's Odyssey, following Odysseus, and so each of the episodes in this book is named after a respective sort of character or moment from the Odyssey. But the Odyssey is by no means the only piece of literature from which Joyce draws on. There are countless allusions to other works within this book, and so I think it is very important to sort of have that baseline knowledge of what Joyce is drawing from here to sort of respect a lot of the work. I actually have some notes here which I'll read from just to collect my thoughts better. So really going into this, I didn't, however, I would probably suggest reading Joyce's other works, particularly Dubliners and Portrait of a Young Artist as a Young Man, because there's a lot of characters within Ulysses that come from his other works, and so if you have that familiarity with them, it might make understanding what's going on in this book a bit easier. Particularly for the artist, the Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man, that follows Stephen throughout his earlier life. And since he's one of the main characters here, you might get a better idea of who he is if you read that before. I haven't read it yet, so I can't say, but I would imagine that would help you understand this book better. Interestingly, I think Stephen was based a little bit off of Joyce himself, and so he puts a lot of his own experience and thoughts into that character. Stephen also draws very heavily on Shakespeare. A lot of what he thinks about relates back to Shakespeare. So having some familiarity with some of his plays, particularly Hamlet and Macbeth, would be helpful. Obviously the Odyssey, if you've read that before, would be good. And then I wasn't expecting this, but he also draws a lot on the Divine Comedy of Dante, which, lucky for me, I had just read the first one just before starting this book, so that was very nice. Moving on to some of the themes I took particular note of in this book. Early on, we learn that Stephen's mother has just passed away, and this is a death that has really haunted him. I think he also had an experience where a man drowned in front of him, and someone else saved the man. So death is very much a thing that is present on Stephen's mind, and he ends up associating this a lot with water, and he's deathly afraid of water. So that I found very interesting. And there's this recurring motif of well, would he have the courage to, save another person's life? But this is very much a different perspective between the characters. For both Bloom and Molly, his wife, water is actually seen as more like a rejuvenating force. And so we have the ways that these different themes present in the lives of these different characters. Obviously, because this is a book about Ireland in the early 1900s, nationalism and sort of like the future state of Ireland is very much up for debate here, because it was still a part of England. And so we have a lot of interesting commentary from Joyce on Irish nationalism. He's not just full gung-ho in support of Irish nationalists, and he actually throws a lot of critique at some of the more well-loved literary figures of the Irish nationalist movement, like W.B. Yeats. So that's something that I found kind of surprising, and I had to look into that a little bit more to figure out what he was trying to get at. But it really seems like he's critiquing sort of this free Irish states, free statism, which happened in the early 1900s. And this was more of a departure from the radical like Sinn Féin style of Republican nationalism for Ireland. This is what Joyce is more a proponent of. And really the way that he writes Bloom is a stand-in for this more radical nationalism that Joyce was a proponent of. And the reason for this is that because Bloom is an outsider, he would want a society in which outsiders like Bloom were accepted. I think this is a thread from the book that I still want to do a little bit more research on, because it seems like Joyce was throwing around a lot of critiques that I was not sure like where they were landing, what side he was on. And so yeah, I just want to look more into that, but I found it quite interesting. Going hand in hand with this, religion is also obviously very, very important in this book. Ireland at the time was very heavily divided between its Catholic population and its Protestant population, with the Protestants being of the more like English-leaning type, and they had a lot of control in the government, and so there's a lot of persecution against the Catholic population in Ireland, even though that was actually like a majority. Stephen himself is Catholic, and he has this very large fixation on sort of the Holy Trinity, and I connected this to his own relationship with his father, who we actually encounter many times throughout the book, and seems like a relatively, nice man, and yet Stephen is completely like alienated from him. And I think this might be in part because Stephen is one child out of many, many children within his household, and so he probably never really received much attention from his father, and so he just left that house at a very relatively young age, and kind of like disassociated himself from the rest of his family, which is pretty sad. And then we have Bloom, who's Jewish, and he's really this embodiment as sort of like a prophet-like figure, like Elijah. And there's a very interesting part where he recounts his day through like various Jewish rituals, which I found very, very interesting, and I'll read that. So this comes from Ithaca, which was maybe my favorite chapter, and it's presented as a series of catechisms, so like question and answer, in the religious sense. And actually that's part of the interesting thing about this book is that each section is written in a completely different style. Some of them are more interesting than others. This one I particularly liked, and this is a passage here. What past consecutive causes before rising pre-apprehended of accumulated fatigue did Bloom, before rising, silently recapitulate? The preparation of breakfast, burnt offering, intestinal congestion and premeditative defecation, holy of holies, the bath, rite of John, the funeral, rite of Samuel, the advertisement of Alexander Keys, Urim and Thummim, the unsubstantial lunch, rite of Melchizedek, the visit to museum and National Library, holy place, the book hunt along Bedford Row, Merchant's Arch, Wellington Quay, Simchath Torah, the music in the Ormond Hotel, Shir Shurim, the altercation with the trunculate troglodyte in Vernon Kiernan's premises, Holocaust, a blank period of time including a car drive, a visit to a house of mourning, a leave-taking, wilderness, the eroticism produced by feminine exhibitionism, rite of Onan, the prolonged delivery of Miss Mina Purefoy, heave offering, the visit to the disorderly house of Miss Bella Cohen, 82 Tyrone Street Lower, and subsequent brawl and chance medley in Beaver Street, Armageddon. Nocturnal preambulation to and from the cabman's shelter, Butt Bridge, Atonement. I, of course, had to look up what a lot of these rites are, but just the way in which Joyce and subsequently Bloom is able to connect like all the different aspects of his daily life to these different rites, I just thought was really, really cool and interesting. And since this chapter comes towards the end of the book, it's really like a culmination of everything that's happened in the day, sort of adding up to this one point. One of the coolest parallels I saw also came from this chapter, and I'll just read my notes again here. So we have Stephen, who's one of many children. He feels neglected by his family, and he sort of voluntarily estranges himself. And this leads to like a fixation on paternal aspects. We have Bloom, whose marriage is failing. He's being cuckolded by his wife. And this is really the result of the death of his son after like 11 days or something like that. So very premature death. And also he has a daughter, Millie, who's growing up, and so she's left the house. And this may be also leading to his yearn to once again be a fatherly figure. And so once he comes across Stephen, he really hopes to be able to like guide Stephen. And this culminates in Ithaca with the ritual departure of Stephen. As Bloom leads Stephen back out to the garden from which they'll leave, they reenact pretty consciously the Hebrew exodus from Egypt, and Jewish Passover and Christian rites. So Bloom holds a candle, taking role of the fatherly priest, and Stephen wears a deaconal hat, playing the sunlight assistant deacon role. Stephen quotes Psalm 113, which is also spoken by the dead in Dante's Purgatorio, and then they behold the cosmos in the night sky. This is a mirroring of the end of Dante's Inferno, as Virgil and Dante leave hell and witness the stars, which for Dante really represents the divine. Furthermore, in the Divine Comedy, people are enlightened and helped to ascend by essentially candle bearers lighting the way, which is the role that Bloom is playing here. And this also reflects the writings of St. Augustine, who believed that the Jews carried the lamp of law while remaining in darkness themselves. And of course, just like Virgil, Bloom himself is not a Christian, and so we see this role sort of like further carried on. However, for Bloom and Joyce, the cosmos don't symbolize the divine, as a lengthy scientific investigation preceding this sort of reveals. And then Bloom and Stephen separate. We see this sort of proposed unity broken off as the two men's differences ultimately win out. So ultimately, a relatively pessimistic ending for our two main characters, but one rich with a lot of symbolism and pretty realistic, I would say. Another theme that comes up a lot in this book is the influence of the past on our present life. All of our characters are constantly thinking back over moments from their past, but Joyce really seems to be making the point that this doesn't constitute a reliving of the past, and that one cannot and should not linger on the past. You have to be making new memories and experiencing new things. Another very core connecting theme in this book is parallax. This is the idea that seeing the same thing from two different perspectives can often give you two completely different looking things. And so Joyce introduces a lot of central ideas, like the ones I just talked about, and then spends the remaining chapters exploring them from different styles and perspectives. So it's all the same thing, and then we can see it from many different ways. So that's maybe one of the core analyses as to what this book is trying to do. It's trying to show us the same thing from many different perspectives. Touching more on the religious aspect, as well as sort of just the culture of Ireland, there's a lot of anti-Semitism in this book targeted at Bloom, and I sort of saw this as a stand-in maybe towards the hostile attitude that Catholics had toward Protestants and vice versa. Bloom and Joyce are very much trying to preach a very inclusive society, and so even though the Protestants are oppressing the Catholics, that doesn't mean that the Catholics should then, once they have power, go and oppress the Protestants. Everyone should be accepted, and for Bloom and maybe for Joyce as well, the connecting word here is love. We need to have a society that's full of love. One interesting thing I noted about the narrative structure of this and sort of the progression of the book, First, we have Stephen and Bloom's perspectives separated by chapters. Then both of their perspectives begin to exist in the same chapter, but the narrative's still only told from one of their perspectives. And then both perspectives are given but separated by sections. And finally, we get both perspectives intertwined. And this is when the book becomes probably more difficult because you're constantly jumping back and forth between their different perspectives, and it's hard to tell who's thinking what. But since you're introduced so well to the characters earlier on in the novel, and it's very separated out, you do become very able to fluidly move between the two characters' thoughts. And that's one thing to note about this book. At the beginning, it is very, very challenging. Joyce, of course, writes in very interesting ways, very unconventional ways. And you're very much in the heads of these characters, and until you're familiar with them and how they think, that can be very disconcerting and very hard to follow. However, because you follow them for so many pages and it's just two characters primarily, you do gain very intimate knowledge of who they are and what they're thinking, and it becomes much easier to follow the narrative. I think for me the most difficult chapter was Proteus. This comes very early on, it's like the third chapter, and that's all just in Stephen's head. And there's a lot of very minuscule references that I was not familiar with, and it took me a lot of work to get through it. I'll show some pictures of my annotations for that because it's definitely where I annotated the most. It's only 15 or 20 pages worth of chapter, but it took me a very long time to get through. It's very difficult. Once you get past the beginning of the book, I think it does get a lot easier, but it's probably safe to say this is the hardest book that I've read at this point. So I think its reputation for being a difficult book is well earned, but at the same time, you can read this book, and as long as you keep up at it and power through it, I think you will enjoy it, and it's not going to be that difficult. It depends on how much you want to get out of it. If you want to do a full scholarly, analysis of the book, yeah, that's going to be very difficult and take you a very long time. But I think there's something for everyone to enjoy in it, and it's very interesting. Surprising to me, for being a book being written in the 1920s, it's very sexually obscene. I was not expecting that at all. The last chapter of this book follows Molly, Bloom's wife, and her thoughts, and a lot of that is just sexual fantasy, which is very odd. Not sure if that characterization of her as just thinking about sex is maybe a little misogynistic by Joyce. I was a little weirded out by that. But at the same time, it is him trying to put himself in another perspective, and that's what he's trying to do with a lot of these characters, with Bloom himself as well. Joyce was Catholic, and then Bloom is Jewish, so he's trying to cast himself in these different roles that he's not familiar with, maybe again connecting back to that parallax point. So yeah, the chapter with Molly is very interesting. It has this recurring motif of the word yes, which Joyce viewed as a very feminine word, but also a very positive word. That, of course, is the last word of the entire book as well. And so the book does end on a very hopeful note. We have this, another thing that I found very interesting is that it has a lot of similarity to Gravity's Rainbow, actually. And I think you can tell that a lot of these themes were really just pulled directly from Ulysses. I think Pynchon borrowed pretty heavily from that. Obviously not with the whole narrative and stuff like that, but just some of the specific themes like tarot, we have the witching hour, just specific sections like these, I think Pynchon was very inspired by. Also, if you've read Mrs. Dalloway by Virginia Woolf, it's a similar story there. I think she pulled a lot of the narrative structure for that book from this, and was very heavily inspired by it, which is cool to see. I think now that I've read it, I'll see other parallels and other pieces of work. I think it has been just a highly influential book, one of the most famous books ever. So there it is. It took me 6 or 7 months to get through Ulysses. I'm glad I finally read it. I do quite enjoy it. I think the more I reread it and the more I become familiar with Joyce and the rest of his works, I think I'll gain even more appreciation for it. But I think I took quite a bit out of it, even just from a first reading. Again, excited to read it more. But I think it's not going to be, necessarily one of my favorite books of all time. But again, very glad that I read it. If any of you have read it, I'd be very interested to hear your own thoughts. Or if you've been curious about it, I hope that maybe this video has inspired you to read it. I don't really think it's possible to spoil this book. So don't be worried about that. If anything, I think maybe the more you know about this book, the better off you'd be reading it. So again, I encourage you to read it if you think you'd be interested in it.